Under Charles I of England, the Puritans became a political force as well as a religious tendency in the country. Opponents of the royal prerogative became allies of Puritan reformers, who saw the Church of England moving in a direction opposite to what they wanted, and objected to increased Roman Catholic influence both at court and within the Church. After the First English Civil War, political power was held by various factions of Puritans. The trials and executions of William Laud and then King Charles himself were decisive moves shaping British history. While in the short term Puritan power was consolidated by the parliamentary armed forces and Oliver Cromwell in the same years, the argument for theocracy failed to convince enough of the various groupings, and there was no Puritan religious settlement to match Cromwell's gradual assumption of dictatorial powers. The distinctive formulation of Reformed theology in the Westminster Assembly would prove to be its lasting legacy. In New England, immigration of what were Puritan family groups and congregations was at its peak for the period in the middle years of King Charles's reign, from the Synod of Dort to the death of Archbishop Abbott. For around a dozen years before Lord Ian Ism in the Church of England became the movement directly opposed by Puritans, there was a growing confrontation between Puritanism and Arminians, a term less easy to define in an English context. Arminians in this sense were moderates on, or even opposed to, some key tenets of Calvinism. In the same period the 12 Years' Truce ended, and the 30 Years' War broke out, changing the international situation in Western Europe drastically. James I of England generally supported the counter-remonstrant position against the Dutch Arminians. In fact, James had contributed to the hounding of Conrad Vorstius, and sent a strong delegation to the Synod of Dort, making it an important international Protestant council and underlining the condemnation of Vorstius as a heretic. It was only in the period of the proposed Spanish match that James tried to adopt a less anti-Catholic approach, offending many Puritan figures in so doing. Arminian in English usage was not such a precise theological term, in fact, and James's views allowed for some diversity. Charles, Prince of Wales, became king on the death of his father James I in 1625. Charles was distrustful of Puritans, who began defining themselves against Arminian moderates on church and foreign policy, simply as an opposition group, believing as he did in the divine right of kings and lacking his father's deftness in these matters. Charles had no particular interest in theological questions, but preferred the emphasis on order, decorum, uniformity, and spectacle in Christian worship. Whereas James had supported the canons of the Synod of Dort, Charles forbade preaching on the subject of predestination altogether. Where James had been lenient towards clergy who omitted parts of the Book of Common Prayer, Charles urged the bishops to enforce compliance with the prayer book, and to suspend ministers who refused. Besides George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham, Charles's closest political advisor was William Laud, the Bishop of St. David's, whom Charles translated to the better position of Bishop of Bath and Wells in 1626. Under Laud's influence, Charles shifted the royal ecclesiastical policy markedly. In 1625, shortly before the opening of the new Parliament, Charles was married by proxy to Henrietta Maria of France, the Catholic daughter of Henry IV of France. In diplomatic terms, this implied alliance with France in preparation for war against Spain, but Puritan MPs openly claimed that Charles was preparing to restrict the recusancy laws. The king had indeed agreed to do so in the secret marriage treaty he negotiated with Louis XIII of France. George Abbot, Archbishop of Canterbury from 1611, was in the mainstream of the English Church, sympathetic with Scottish Protestants, anti-Catholic in a conventional Calvinist way, and theologically opposed to Arminianism. Under Elizabeth I he had associated with Puritan figures. The controversy over Richard Montague's anti-Calvinist new gag was still open when Parliament met in May 1625. Puritan MP John Pym launched an attack on Richard Montague in the House of Commons. As a response, Montague wrote a pamphlet entitled Appellos Aerum, in which he appealed to Charles to protect him against the Puritans. Charles responded by making Montague a royal chaplain, signaling that he was willing to defend Montague against Puritan opposition. The Parliament was reluctant to grant Charles revenue, since they feared that it might be used to support an army that would reimpose Catholicism on England. The 1625 Parliament broke the precedent of centuries and voted to allow Charles to collect tonnage and poundage only for 1 year. When Charles wanted to intervene in the 30 Years' War by declaring war on Spain, Parliament granted him an insufficient sum of £140,000. The war with Spain went ahead. Buckingham was put in charge of the war effort, but failed. The York House Conference of 1626 saw battle lines start to be drawn up. Opponents cast doubt on the political loyalties of the Puritans, equating the beliefs with resistance theory. In the preaching, Arminians began to take a royalist line. Abbott was deprived of effective power in 1627 in a quarrel with the king over Robert Sibthorpe, one such royalist cleric. Richard Montague was made Bishop of Chichester in 1628. The Anglo-French War was also a military failure. Parliament called for Buckingham's replacement, but Charles stuck by him. Parliament went on to pass the Petition of Right, a declaration of Parliament's rights. Charles accepted the petition, though this did not lead to a change in his behavior. The king's personal rule in August 1628, Buckingham was assassinated by disillusioned soldier John Felton. Public reaction angered Charles. When Parliament resumed sitting in January 1629, Charles was met with outrage over the case of John Roll, an MP who had been prosecuted for failing to pay tonnage and poundage. John Finch, the Speaker of the House of Commons, was held down in the Speaker's chair in order to allow the House to pass a resolution condemning the king. Charles determined to rule without calling a parliament, thus initiating the period known as his personal rule. This period saw the ascendancy of Laudianism in England. Laudianism. The central ideal of Laudianism was the beauty of holiness. This emphasized a love of ceremony and harmonious liturgy. Many of the churches in England had fallen into disrepair in the wake of the English Reformation. Laudianism called for making churches beautiful. Churches were ordered to make repairs and to enforce greater respect for the church building. A policy particularly odious to the Puritans was the installation of altar rails in churches, which Puritans associated with the Catholic position on transubstantiation. In Catholic practice, altar rails served to demarcate the space where Christ became incarnate in the host, with priests, acolytes, and altar boys allowed inside the rail. They also argued that the practice of receiving communion while kneeling at the rail too much resembled Catholic Eucharistic adoration. The Laudians insisted on kneeling at communion and receiving at the rail, denying that this involved accepting Catholic positions. Puritans also objected to the Laudian insistence on calling members of the clergy priests. In their minds, the word priest meant someone who offers a sacrifice, and was therefore related in their minds to Catholic teaching on the Eucharist as a sacrifice. After the Reformation, the term minister was generally adopted by Protestants to describe their clergy. Puritans argued in favor of its use, or else for simply transliterating the Greek word presbyter used in the New Testament without translation. The Puritans were also dismayed when the Laudians insisted on the importance of keeping Lent, a practice which had fallen into disfavor in England after the Reformation. They favored fast days specifically called by the Church or the government in response to the problems of the day, rather than days dictated by the ecclesiastical calendar. The foundation of Puritan New England, 1630 to 1642. For more information, see History of the Puritans in North America. Some Puritans began considering founding their own colony where they could worship in a fully reformed church, far from King Charles and the bishops. This was a quite distinct view of the church from that held by the separatists of Plymouth Colony. John Winthrop, a lawyer who had practiced in the Court of Wards, began to explore the idea of creating a Puritan colony in New England. The Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony had proved that such a colony was viable. In 1627, the existing Dorchester Company for New England colonial expansion went bankrupt, but was succeeded by the New England Company. Throughout 1628 and 1629, Puritans in Winthrop's social circle discussed the possibility of moving to New England. The New England Company sought clearer title to the New England land of the proposed settlement than was provided by the Sheffield patent, and in March 1629 succeeded in obtaining from King Charles a royal charter changing the name of the company to the Governor and Company of the Massachusetts Bay in New England and granting them the land to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The royal charter establishing the Massachusetts Bay Company had not specified where the company's annual meetings should be held. This raised the possibility that the governor of the company could move to the new colony and serve as governor of the colony, while the general court of the company could be transformed into the colony's legislative assembly. John Winthrop participated in these discussions and in March 1629 signed the Cambridge Agreement, by which the non-emigrating shareholders of the company agreed to turn over control of the company to the emigrating shareholders. As Winthrop was the wealthiest of the emigrating shareholders, the company decided to make him governor and entrusted him with the company charter. Winthrop sailed for New England in 1630 along with 700 colonists on board 11 ships known collectively as the Winthrop Fleet. Winthrop himself sailed on board the Arbor. During the crossing, he preached a sermon entitled A Model of Christian Charity, in which he called on his fellow settlers to make the new colony a city upon a hill, meaning that they would be a model to all the nations of Europe as to what a properly reformed Christian commonwealth should look like. The context in 1630 was that the 30 Years' War was going badly for the Protestants, and Catholicism was being restored in lands previously reformed, e.g., by the 1629 Edict of Restitution. Emigration was officially restricted to conforming churchmen in December 1634 by the Privy Council.